The Last Horseman Chapter 1. The drifter. The sun beat down on the dusty plains, baking the earth until it cracked and split. A lone figure on horseback emerged from the shimmering heat haze, his silhouette stark against the vast expanse of the sky. He was a man weathered by time and hardship, his face etched with the lines of countless journeys under the unforgiving sun. His name was Silas, and he was a drifter, a relic of a bygone era where men lived and died by the saddle. Silas rode a magnificent palomino, its golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. The horse was more than just a means of transport, it was his companion, his confidant, and his lifeline in this desolate land. They moved as one, their rhythm in sync with the heartbeat of the West. He wasn't a man of many words, Silas. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a depth that spoke volumes about the life he had lived. They had witnessed the beauty and brutality of the frontier, the rise and fall of towns, and the relentless march of progress that threatened to erase the old ways. Silas was a horseman, a breed that was slowly fading into the annals of history. The railroads were snaking their way across the land, bringing with them the promise of civilization and the demise of the cowboy way of life. But Silas clung to the old ways, to the freedom of the open range and the code of the West. He wasn't just a drifter, he was a seeker. Years ago, he had lost his beloved wife, Eliza, to a band of outlaws. He had scoured the West searching for her, following every lead, every whisper in the wind. But Eliza remained elusive, a ghost that haunted his waking hours and his dreams. His search had led him to this desolate corner of the West, a place where the law was as scarce as water in the desert. He had heard rumors of a hidden valley, a sanctuary where outlaws and renegades sought refuge. It was a long shot, but Silas had nothing left to lose. As he rode, he thought of Eliza, her laughter echoing in the chambers of his heart. She had been the love of his life, the anchor that had kept him grounded. Without her, he was adrift, a tumbleweed rolling across the plains. He reached a small town, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled around a dusty main street. The saloon doors swung open, beckoning him with the promise of whiskey and companionship. Silas hesitated, then dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching rail. He needed a drink, and maybe some information. The saloon was a cacophony of noise and smells, the air thick with the stench of stale beer and sweat. A piano player pounded out a raucous tune, while men with calloused hands and weary eyes huddled around tables, their voices a low rumble in the dimly lit room. Silas approached the bar, his spurs clinking on the wooden floor. The bartender, a burly man with a handlebar mustache, eyed him with suspicion. "What can I get you, stranger?" he growled. "Whiskey," Silas said, his voice rough as gravel. "And any news from the south?" The bartender slid him a glass, his eyes narrowing. "News travels slow in these parts." "What kind of news you looking for?" "I'm looking for a woman," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. "She was taken by outlaws a few years back." The bartender grunted. "Outlaws? Who?" "This whole territory's crawling with them. You'd be better off heading back east, where there's some semblance of law and order." Silas shook his head. "I can't go back. Not without her." The bartender shrugged. "Suit yourself, stranger. But don't say I didn't warn you." Silas downed his whiskey in one gulp, the fiery liquid burning its way down his throat. He slammed the glass on the bar, the sound echoing through the saloon. "I'll find her," he muttered, more to himself than to the bartender. "Even if it's the last thing I do." He turned and walked out of the saloon, his spurs clinking a defiant rhythm. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Silas mounted his horse and rode out of town, his silhouette fading into the twilight. He was alone once more, but he was not without hope. He would find Eliza, even if it meant riding to the ends of the earth. Chapter 3. The shaman's vision. Silas rode for days, his journey taking him deeper into the heart of the untamed West. The landscape changed from arid plains to rolling hills, the vegetation becoming lusher with every mile. He crossed rivers and streams, his horses' hooves leaving ripples in the clear water. He saw herds of buffalo grazing on the grasslands, their massive bodies dark against the emerald green. He felt a sense of peace as he rode, the rhythm of the horse's gait lulling him into a meditative state. But the peace was shattered one evening as he made camp by a small creek. A guttural cry pierced the stillness, followed by the sound of pounding hooves. Silas grabbed his rifle, his senses on high alert. He peered through the gathering darkness, his eyes straining to make out the source of the commotion. A band of Indians emerged from the shadows, their faces painted with war paint, their feathers swaying in the wind. They rode bareback, their bodies lean and muscular. They circled Silas's camp, their eyes burning with a fierce intensity. Silas stood his ground, his rifle raised. He didn't want trouble, but he wouldn't hesitate to defend himself. He had learned long ago that the West was a land where violence could erupt at any moment. The leader of the Indians rode forward, his hand raised in a gesture of peace. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. He approached Silas, his eyes filled with curiosity. "Greetings, stranger," he said in broken English. "I am Chaitan, chief of the Lakota. What brings you to our land?" Silas lowered his rifle, his tension easing slightly. "I am Silas," he said. "I am searching for someone." "A woman?" Chaitan nodded. "Many people come to this land searching for something." "What is the name of this woman?" "Eliza," Silas said. "She was taken by outlaws a few years back." Chaitan's eyes widened. "Eliza? I have heard this name. She is the one who was taken by the white men with the snakes on their chests." Silas's heart leaped with hope. Chaitan knew about Eliza. Maybe he could help him find her. "Yes," Silas said. "Do you know where she is?" Chaitan shook his head. "I do not know where she is now. But I know who can help you." He turned and gestured towards a small figure standing at the edge of the circle of Indians. It was an old man, his face wrinkled and weathered, his eyes filled with ancient wisdom. "This is Tykoda," Chaitan said. "He is our shaman. He has the gift of sight." Tykoda stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Silas. He spoke in Lakota, his voice a low chant. Chaitan translated. "Tykoda says that he sees a vision. He sees a woman with hair like the sun and eyes like the sky. She is in a place of darkness, surrounded by men with evil in their hearts." Silas felt a shiver run down his spine. Tykoda's vision matched Eliza perfectly. "Can he tell me where she is?" Silas asked. Chaitan relayed the question to Tykoda, who closed his eyes and concentrated. After a moment, he opened his eyes and spoke again. "Tykoda says that she is in a place of stone and iron. A place where the white men dig for gold." Silas's mind raced. "A place of stone and iron? A place where the white men dig for gold? Could Tykoda be talking about a mining town? Is there a name?" Silas asked. Tykoda closed his eyes again, his brow furrowed in concentration. He muttered a few words, then opened his eyes and spoke. "Tykoda says the name is Redemption. Redemption." Silas had never heard of a town with that name, but he would find it. He had to find Eliza. He thanked Chaitan and Tykoda, his heart filled with gratitude. He had been lost and alone, but now he had a new lead, a new direction. He would ride to Redemption and find Eliza, even if it meant facing the devil himself. He mounted his horse and rode off into the night, the stars guiding his way. He didn't know what awaited him in Redemption, but he was ready for anything. He had the Lakota's blessing, and he had the fire of determination burning in his soul. He would find Eliza, and he would bring her home. Chapter 4: Redemption. Redemption. The name itself was a paradox, a beacon of hope in a land steeped in sin. Silas rode towards it with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. He had followed Tykoda's vision, his journey taking him through treacherous mountain passes and across sun-baked deserts. He had endured hunger, thirst, and fatigue, his determination fueled by the thought of Eliza. He finally reached Redemption at dusk, the town emerging from the twilight like a mirage. It was a rough-hewn settlement, a cluster of wooden buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. The streets were crowded with miners, prospectors, and gamblers, their faces etched with greed and desperation. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, whiskey, and gunpowder. Silas rode slowly through the town, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. He was looking for any sign of Eliza, any clue that might lead him to her. But the faces were all unfamiliar, hardened by the harsh realities of life on the frontier. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the swinging doors beckoning him with the promise of information and oblivion. He tied his horse to the hitching rail, the Palomino's golden coat gleaming in the fading light. He adjusted the Colt Peacemaker on his hip, a familiar weight that brought him a sense of comfort. The saloon was a cacophony of noise and chaos, the air thick with smoke and the stench of stale beer. A piano player pounded out a ragtime tune, the melody barely audible above the din of drunken laughter and shouted conversations. Silas made his way to the bar, his spurs clinking on the wooden floor. The bartender, a wiry man with a handlebar mustache and a suspicious glint in his eye, eyed Silas with a practiced indifference. "What'll it be, stranger?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Whiskey," Silas said, his voice rough as gravel. "And some information." The bartender slid him a glass, the amber liquid sloshing against the rim. "Information's expensive in these parts," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of information you looking for?" Silas took a sip of the whiskey, the fiery liquid burning its way down his throat. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, his gaze fixed on the bartender. "She was taken by outlaws a few years back." The bartender grunted. "Outlaws? Who?" "This whole town's crawling with them. You'd be better off heading back to where you came from." Silas shook his head. "I can't go back. Not without her." He leaned closer to the bartender, his voice low and intense. "Her name is Eliza. She has hair like the sun and eyes like the sky." The bartender's eyes widened slightly. He looked around the saloon, then leaned back toward Silas. "Eliza, you say? I might know something. But it'll cost you." Silas pulled a gold nugget from his pouch, the fruit of his meager earnings from odd jobs along the trail. He placed it on the bar, the gold glinting under the dim light. "This enough?" The bartender snatched the nugget, his eyes gleaming with greed. "It'll do," he said. "Follow me." He led Silas through a back door, down a narrow hallway, and into a small, dimly lit room. A single oil lamp flickered on a table, casting long shadows on the walls. A woman sat on a chair, her head bowed, her hands bound. Silas's heart pounded in his chest. It was Eliza. She looked thinner, her clothes ragged, but it was her. Her hair, once vibrant and flowing, was now dull and matted. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now filled with fear and despair. "Eliza!" Silas cried out, rushing towards her. She looked up, her eyes widening in recognition. "Silas," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He knelt beside her, his hands gently cupping her face. "It's me," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I found you." Tears streamed down Eliza's face, her body trembling with relief. "I thought I'd never see you again," she sobbed. Silas untied her hands, his fingers fumbling with the knots. He held her close, his arms wrapped tightly around her. He felt her warmth against him, the familiar scent of her hair filling his senses. He had found her. After all these years, he had finally found her. But their reunion was cut short by the sound of footsteps approaching. The door burst open, and a group of men stormed into the room. They were rough-looking characters, their faces hardened by greed and violence. "Well, well, well," a gruff voice said. "Looks like we have some visitors." Silas turned to face the intruders, his eyes blazing with anger. He recognized the leader of the group. It was Jake the Rattler Rourke, the outlaw who had taken Eliza. "Rourke," Silas growled, his hand instinctively reaching for his Colt. Rourke grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "Fancy meeting you here, Silas," he said. "Looks like you finally caught up with me." "Let her go, Rourke," Silas said, his voice low and menacing. She has nothing to do with this. Rourke laughed. Oh, I think she does. She's valuable property, Silas. And I ain't about to let her go without a fight. He gestured to his men, and they fanned out, surrounding Silas and Eliza. Silas drew his Colt, the metal cold against his palm. He knew he was outnumbered, but he wouldn't back down. He would protect Eliza, even if it meant sacrificing his own life. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. A showdown was inevitable. Silas and Rourke locked eyes, their gazes filled with hatred and defiance. The fate of Eliza, and perhaps Silas himself, hung in the balance. Chapter 5, Showdown at Redemption. The air crackled with tension. Silas, Colt drawn, stood protectively in front of Eliza, his eyes locked on Rourke. The outlaws, a motley crew of hardened criminals, circled them, their own weapons glinting in the dim light of the saloon's back room. Rourke, a cruel smile twisting his lips, raised his own revolver. Any last words, Silas? He sneered. Only this, Silas replied, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. You made a mistake coming back here, Rourke. Redemption may be full of sinners, but it ain't got no room for the likes of you. Rourke let out a harsh laugh. You think you can stop me, old man? You and what army? Before Silas could answer, a voice boomed from the doorway. He's got us, Rourke. The saloon doors swung open, revealing a group of men Silas recognized from his brief time in Redemption. There was the blacksmith, his brawny arms crossed over his chest, the stable owner, a shotgun clutched in his calloused hands, and even the grizzled bartender, wielding a surprisingly wicked-looking knife. Behind them, more townsfolk gathered, their faces grim, their eyes filled with a righteous anger that mirrored Silas's own. Rourke's smile faltered. He glanced at his men, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He'd underestimated Silas, and now he was trapped. Looks like the odds have changed, Silas said, his voice laced with steel. Now, I'm gonna ask you one last time. Let her go. Rourke, realizing he was outmatched, cursed under his breath. He shoved Eliza toward Silas, then backed away, his gun still trained on them. This ain't over, Silas, he snarled. I'll be seeing you again. With a flick of his wrist, Rourke fired a shot towards the ceiling, the deafening roar momentarily stunning everyone in the room. In the ensuing chaos, Rourke and his men scrambled out of the back room and disappeared into the maze of saloon hallways. Silas, holding Eliza close, waited until the commotion subsided. He looked at the assembled townsfolk, a wave of gratitude washing over him. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I owe you all a debt I can never repay. The blacksmith stepped forward, a grin spreading across his face. Don't mention it, Silas. We've been needing an excuse to clean up this town for a while now. Rourke and his kind have been terrorizing us for too long. The bartender nodded in agreement. Besides, he said, with a wink towards Eliza, ain't no room for hurting womenfolk in Redemption. Not anymore. Eliza, still shaken but safe in Silas's arms, looked at the faces surrounding them. A sense of belonging, something she hadn't felt in years, warmed her. Maybe, just maybe, redemption could be a new beginning for them. The next morning, Silas and Eliza stood on the edge of town, their horses saddled and ready. The townsfolk had gathered to see them off, their farewells filled with warmth and genuine affection. You're welcome back anytime, Silas, the blacksmith said, offering his hand. And you, Eliza, added the bartender's wife, a kind-faced woman who had taken Eliza under her wing the previous night. Redemption ain't so bad once you get to know it. Eliza smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. Thank you, she said. I'll remember that. Silas shook the blacksmith's hand, then turned to face the crowd. I can't thank you enough for what you did, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved our lives. He looked at Eliza, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. He'd found her, against all odds, and now they were free. The future was uncertain, but they would face it together. With a final wave, they turned their horses towards the rising sun and rode out of redemption, leaving behind the echoes of the past and embracing the promise of a new beginning. Silas, the last horseman, had found his redemption, not in a town or a person, but in the enduring power of love and the unexpected kindness of strangers. As they rode, Silas thought about the journey that had brought them here. He'd faced danger, hardship, and despair, but he'd also found hope, courage, and ultimately, love. The West was changing, the old ways fading, but some things, like honor, loyalty, and the enduring spirit of the human heart, would never die. He was the last horseman, a relic of a bygone era, but he would carry the torch of the Old West, its values and its spirit, into the uncertain future. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the vast expanse of the plains. Silas and Eliza rode on, their silhouettes fading into the horizon, two souls bound by love, forever etched into the legend of the West. Join the adventure with the Western echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed. If you're loving our cowboy stories and captivating tales, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated on all our future posts. Saddle up and ride along with us.